he has done a good job, and I don't say good in a moral sense, but in an effective way. He's done an effective job at undermining institutions, of convincing people that whether it's our electoral process, our courts, our press, that all of these institutions are biased against Trump. And a lot of, I think, Trump's voters have now decided that they must be biased against them as well. I think that's mostly untrue, but it's a democracy. People are allowed to vote based on what they believe. And I think that has been very effective.
A US appeal court has ruled that Donald Trump does not have immunity from charges that he plotted to overturn his 2020 election defeat. Well, the decision brings the former president a step closer to an unprecedented criminal trial over his actions after losing to Joe Biden, which culminated in the riot at the Capitol on January the 6th, 2021. That trial was due to begin on March the 4th of this year, but is now been postponed with no new trial date set. Trump himself has said the ruling cannot be allowed to stand.
It's a very sad thing that's happened with this whole situation. When they talk about threat to democracy, that's your real threat to democracy. And I feel that as a president, you have to have immunity. Very simple. And if you don't, as an example, if this case were lost on immunity, and I did nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong. I'm working for the country. And I worked on very hard on voter fraud because we have to have free elections. We have to have strong voters. We have to have free elections. Those two things almost above all.
Well, the setback for Donald Trump, who still looks on course to win the Republican nomination, comes as his likely Democratic rival, Joe Biden, appeared to be confused over who the French president is. At an event in Las Vegas, the 81-year-old president spoke of his meeting with world leaders at the G7 summit in 2021. But Biden appeared to confuse President Macron with the former French leader, Francois Mitterrand, who died 25 years earlier. The clip has already gone viral.
You know, right after I was elected, I went to what they call a G7 meeting, all the NATO leaders. And it was in the south of England. And I sat down and I said, "America's back." And Mitterrand from France, looked at me and said, "You know, why, how long are you back for?"
Well, David Litt is a former senior speechwriter to President Obama. He's also best-selling author of Thanks, Obama and Democracy in One Book or Less. Good evening to you, David.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you with us. You must have worked pretty closely with Joe Biden. What do you make of that latest mix-up? It didn't seem to be quite clear who the French president was.
Well, I should say, actually, the way the Obama White House worked, the president's speechwriters and the vice president's speechwriters, we knew each other, we were friendly, but we worked for different principles. That said, obviously we know who the French prime minister is, or the French presidency. Now, I made a mix-up myself, potentially. I think what's really notable in this moment is actually the sort of disconnect between an 81-year-old candidate being treated one way and a 77-year-old candidate being treated another. That's the thing that worries me as we head into this election. I mean, Donald Trump recently said he won New Hampshire 3 times. That's not true. And it's interesting to see what goes viral and what doesn't. Obviously politicians say stuff and, they make mistakes. But I think it's important as we head into what might be the most consequential election in American history, we're in this moment where there's this lack of parity in the way each candidate's being treated. And I think that's going to make a really big difference in potentially the way the election and then the course of the next 4 years play out.
I'm sure that there will have been plenty of Joe Biden's opponents who were making sure that clip went viral. But there have been a whole series of apparent instances when Joe Biden was rather confused about who people were, what was going on. Do you think he really is up to another term in the White House?
I genuinely do. I think that one of the things that is really, I think particularly for younger voters, we don't remember is that Joe Biden was somewhat famous. I believe he phrased it as, famous for saying what he believes, but also saying everything he believes. That's a polite way of saying Joe Biden was known for sometimes getting words wrong, partly because he has had a stutter that he overcame when he was younger his whole life. Now, obviously, when you're 81, you speak and you're more likely to have those sort of slip ups than you did when you were 61. But when you look at his record, that's the thing I think there's sort of important these days is you can compare his record to the person he's running against or anyone else. And you look at what he's done on climate, you look at what he's done on infrastructure, you look at a border compromise that Republicans didn't think they could get through. And he's now forged a bipartisan border compromise that would also support Ukraine. He's doing a lot of stuff. This is a guy who's putting points on the board pretty regularly. And so
Well, just to
I
pick
think
you up on that point, I mean, we
yeah,
haven't got a deal to get that aid to Ukraine yet, have we?
we don't. No, and that's the problem. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing in this moment is that Trump, just by becoming the nominee, is already using that position to torpedo a border bill, which the Republicans claim they support action on the border, and in fact, they would rather not do anything on the border and keep it as a political issue. I'm not surprised by that, but I think Biden called their bluff, and right now Republicans are kind of scrambling to try to talk or rather walk the walk. There's another gaffe on my part, and I'm only 37. I think that the other thing that is really important to remember here, though, is when you look at funding to Ukraine. I mean, that's an issue where already it is getting really dire. And I think if you look at what's happened in the Senate, that bill might get across the Senate. In the House, it's going to have a much harder time. And again, the common thread is Donald Trump's Republican Party. If you look at American voters, they still want to support Ukraine. They would definitely like to see some action on the border. And, you're seeing this sort of far right MAGA wing of the Republican Party that's really taking control of the whole thing. And it's already having really devastating policy consequences. That matters more, frankly, than whether the 77-year-old or the 81-year-old is, more articulate.
What about this latest court ruling then, a US appeal court ruling that Donald Trump does not have immunity from those charges, perhaps some of the most serious one amongst this network of legal cases that he faces, that he plotted to overturn his defeat the last time these two leaders met?
Well, I think that when you take the names off of it, it's clear how enormously ridiculous this was, right? The argument that one party made in court was, and I don't mean political party, one that a defendant made in court, was that the president has the right to assassinate a political rival, to send SEAL Team 6 to gun down a political rival, and as long as they do it in office, it's kosher. That's basically the end of democracy. I mean, and the court, which was, by the way, not just made up of Democratic appointees, but a panel of two Democratic and one Republican appointee, unanimously agreed that's ridiculous. I mean, it was a 57-page opinion. They said it in legalese, but the short version is, what are you even talking about here? What worries me is you look at how Trump is treating these legal challenges, and he's making a mockery of this process and stalling and delaying and doing everything he can to manipulate the courts so that we cannot have a legal process. If he becomes president for a second time, he's already promised to do that, but this time controlling the Justice Department, controlling the Oval Office. That's going to be a very scary thing. It's going to really turn the entire premise of the legal system in the United States on its head. It's really frightening stuff.
Watching from the UK, many people do find it quite extraordinary that Donald Trump, despite all those court cases, appears to be very much on course to get that Republican nomination. And indeed, that every court appearance just seems to galvanize his Republican base even more.
Well, I think that for me, and I should say, there's a lot of Americans, myself often included, who say, I can't believe it either. But when you look at what Trump has done very effectively, first of all, has this sort of iron grip on about 35%, maybe 40% of the American electorate, which represents a pretty sizable portion, probably a majority of the Republican Party. And that's very powerful in a two-party system, right? You can really control a lot of outcomes just by having 30, 40% of the voters. So that's one element, just the structural things in the way the American system works. And Trump is exploiting that. And that's his right. He's an effective politician. The other thing that I think is happening is he has done a good job, and I don't say good in a moral sense, but in an effective way. He's done an effective job at undermining institutions, of convincing people that whether it's our electoral process, our courts, our press, that all of these institutions are biased against Trump. And a lot of, I think, Trump's voters have now decided that they must be biased against them as well. I think that's mostly untrue, but it's a democracy. People are allowed to vote based on what they believe. And I think that has been very effective. And it's the reason that Trump, at this point, is really more than an individual candidate. He represents a broader movement, one that has taken control, for the most part, of one of America's two parties.
And if, as seems likely, we do end up with a presidential race which sees Joe Biden confronting once again Donald Trump, what is that campaign going to look like? Because, of course, back in 2020, we were in the midst of the pandemic, and that made it a very unusual campaign in some ways. A lot of the time, Joe Biden was actually having to appeal to voters online, but it also allowed him to stay at home in Delaware. I mean, he's going to have to get out and about quite a lot, isn't he? What's that campaign going to look like?
Well, I assume that Biden would be out and about campaigning because he's a candidate for president. And I think one of the things that's notable about that is most of the time when he's out there, I mean, I think about the State of the Union, he's now done three of them, I think, and they've been consistently really good. And I think he gets underrated in a way that actually works very well for him politically, right? People have underestimated Joe Biden since he started running for the Democratic nomination in 2019. Sorry, is that 2019? Yeah, I'm losing track of what year it is. And the thing that I think this race is really going to come down to, I mean, there's lots of factors that we don't know yet. Is Trump going to be convicted of a crime? What's going to happen with the economy? What's going to happen in either the Middle East or in Ukraine? I mean, there's all sorts of X factors we don't know about. But I do think that fundamentally, it seems likely that this is going to be a race where voters have to decide who they want to be president. And many independent voters, if we're being honest, right now have unfavorable opinions of both likely candidates, almost certain candidates. So if this is a race where people say, do I want Trump to be president? They will probably vote for Joe Biden. And right now, I think a lot of independents, if they go into the booth saying, do I want Joe Biden to be president? They're going to vote for Donald Trump. And so it's ultimately a question of, is this a referendum on Biden or a choice between these two candidates? And I think the Biden team both knows that and is probably looking to shape that choice in the coming months.
The polls are suggesting that Joe Biden is behind Donald Trump in those key swing states which ultimately always decide the election. How can he turn that around, do you think?
I think there's a couple of elements. One is, I'm not one of those people that likes to disbelieve polls. I think they tend to be accurate more often than they aren't. But a poll is a snapshot of what a race looks like today. And if you look at a lot of voters, they're not engaged yet. And many of them, kind of like what you were saying with people in the UK, are just stunned about the idea that Donald Trump might be the nominee again. They don't really believe it. I think that's going to change fairly soon. And I think what you've seen in polls recently is that Biden has really dropped off with younger voters. And I think there's a very good chance that a lot of those younger voters come back to him. What's interesting is, to a large extent, you saw a recent NBC News poll that came out, and Biden's numbers are down. Trump's numbers haven't moved much one way or the other. So the number of undecided voters or people who say, I don't want to vote for any of these people, has gone up. I think as we get closer and closer to November, which is still a ways away, I mean, that's the Biden team's job, is to shape this choice and re-engage some of those voters who right now, frankly, might have been saying, I wish we had a candidate other than Joe Biden. And I think that's okay. But Biden's job is to say, listen, this is a choice. You have two choices in this election. And, who do you think would do a better job over the next 4 years?
So do you think Joe Biden really can win again?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that's just tough about being a Democrat is we love to worry. Biden is down a couple of points in most polls, not every poll these days, but he's down a couple of points in most polls. And Democrats, of course, are very concerned. Now, part of that is because if Trump wins, the consequences are going to be catastrophic for America in a variety of ways. But part of it is, we're not used to this, right? Trump was down at least this much for both of his elections that he ran. He won one of them in the Electoral College. He lost the other, but by a lot less than a lot of polls suggested. And so I do think that while there's lots of ways I'm glad we don't emulate Trump's Republican Party, a little bit of resilience and being able to say, okay, we're down a couple of points in the polls. Let's keep fighting this and just doing the work. And I think, for what it's worth, if you look at the people who, who are in politics full time and are really trying to drive that outcome, I think they get it. I think you have a lot of people with plenty of backbone, and it's okay to be down in the polls for, a little while. The one that really matters, obviously, is going to be on election day. And I do think the Biden team has a path, not just to turn things around, but potentially to win by quite a lot, particularly if the economy improves.
David Litt, former senior speechwriter for President Obama. Good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The world is now seeing for the first time things like Russiagate, things like the Jan 6th inquiry, things like the Hunter Biden laptop, the 51 Intel letter. They're seeing these multiple disinformation campaigns, and they're seeing a weaponized system of justice.
I don't think we interpret them as disinformation campaigns.
Well, that's the problem. I believe that's the problem. We caught the DOJ lying about Hunter Biden's laptop and the FBI. They just this
You're
week
basically
said,
calling the whole of the American legal system corrupt